You did not become cold. You finally stopped translating what was already legible. For years, you called it compassion. You called it depth. You called it seeing the wound beneath the behavior. You told yourself that if you could just understand where someone was coming from, the hurt would become smaller, the relationship would become workable, and the love would remain intact. For a long time, that interpretation held. It held because it had to. It held because the alternative had not yet become bearable. Then something quiet happened. You were sitting across from someone whose behavior you had explained 100 times, and this time the explanation did not arrive. The reflex to soften what they had just said failed. The sentence that usually appeared in your mind, the one that began with maybe they and ended with a reason, did not appear. You simply saw what was happening, and in the silence that followed, you felt something you did not expect. You felt cruel. That is where the misunderstanding begins. Not in the seeing, but in the meaning you gave to the seeing. You had been trained, long before you had language for it, to believe that clarity about another person was a form of harm. To perceive someone without editing them felt like a betrayal of love. Understanding meant excusing. Excusing meant staying. And staying meant loving. So when the excuses stopped arriving on their own, you did not think you had grown. You thought you had hardened, but you had not hardened. Something older had simply grown tired. The empathy for which you were praised was never only empathy. It was also labor. It was the ongoing, unpaid work of turning what someone did into what they might have meant. It was the private translation service you ran between their behavior and their intention, so that the behavior could be tolerated and the intention could still be loved. You did this so automatically that you mistook it for perception itself. You believed you were seeing them. You were, in fact, seeing a version of them that your compassion had partially authored. The moment you stopped writing that version, you did not stop loving, you stopped translating. Those are not the same act, but they had lived inside you as one act for so long that their separation felt like a moral collapse. Consider what actually happened in that quiet moment. Someone spoke or acted in a way that would have, in another person's life, been received exactly as it was delivered, a dismissal received as a dismissal, a withdrawal received as a withdrawal, a refusal received as a refusal, but in your life, that reception had always been intercepted. Something inside you reached for an explanation before the feeling could land. Maybe they are tired. Maybe they did not mean it that way. Maybe something is happening that I cannot see. The sentence arrived so quickly that you never noticed it was a sentence. You thought it was your natural way of loving people. The day the sentence did not arrive, you did not become a colder person. You encountered, for the first time, the temperature the situation had always carried. There is a specific loneliness in this recognition, because if you were not being cruel, if you were simply seeing, then you must also accept that all the years of not seeing were something, and they were something. They were a strategy, a beautiful, exhausting, generous, deeply intelligent strategy with a function you did not consciously choose. The function was not enlightenment. The function was preservation. You kept the relationship intact by keeping the interpretation soft. You kept the person available by keeping their behavior explainable. You kept love possible by leaving part of reality unwritten. This was not weakness, it was skill. It was a skill you had refined so quietly that the skill itself had become invisible. You did not know you were choosing to soften what happened. You believed the softness was reality. Something in your chest already knew this before your mind agreed to it. You may have noticed during the last months or years that certain conversations began to tire you before they even began. A name would appear on your phone, and your shoulders would answer before the message did. You would feel the small internal preparation, the low hum of getting ready to interpret, the quiet gathering of generous explanations. Underneath that preparation, if you listened closely, there was a fatigue that did not belong to the conversation itself. It belonged to everything you knew you would have to do with the conversation afterward. You had been turning other people's behavior into something survivable for so long that the muscle had begun to protest. And this is where the shame slips in. Uninvited, as that reflex weakens, the behavior of others becomes suddenly, undeniably visible. You see what they do, you see what they choose, you see the pattern that had been sitting in plain sight, dressed in your interpretations, and instead of feeling clear, you feel unkind. It feels as though the seeing itself is the wound, as though clarity is a form of aggression you are committing against someone who did not consent to being seen. But clarity is not aggression. Clarity is the end of an invisible labor you were taught never to count. Notice how strange that sentence feels. Notice the small resistance in you as you hear it. That resistance is the whole architecture. That resistance is the reason you have called this moment cruelty. Because to say the translation was labor is to admit that it belonged to you. It was yours to give, yours to withhold, and yours to finally notice. If it was yours, then you had been giving something valuable, invisibly. For years, you had been giving it to people who did not know you were giving it, and who might therefore feel its absence without ever understanding what had changed. They will not experience your clarity as clarity. They will experience it as your absence, and when you feel their reaction, you will confuse the loss of your labor with harm you have caused them. That confusion is the birthplace of the word cruel. It is not cruel to stop performing an unspoken service, but it feels cruel because the service had been folded so deeply into what you called love that its withdrawal feels like love withdrawn. You may already notice, as you listen, that a specific relationship is forming itself in your mind, a parent whose behavior you have narrated for decades, a partner whose contradictions you have integrated so smoothly that even you can no longer locate them, a friend whose disappointments in you have always been reframed as the consequence of their own difficulties. You do not have to name the person. The body has already answered. There is a slight tightening somewhere, a small holding, the beginning of the old preparation to defend them again. That reflex is not love. It is the muscle memory of a labor that once made love feel possible. And here, the deeper conflict begins to show itself, slowly and without hurry, because if the labor made love feel possible, then to stop performing it is to risk discovering something you have spent years arranging not to discover. You are afraid that if you stop translating, what remains will not be love. You are afraid that the relationship you have been protecting was, in part, sustained by your protection of it, that its warmth required your work, that if you stop working, the warmth will not survive on its own. This is why the day you stopped mistaking clarity for cruelty was not a triumphant day. It was a quiet, disoriented day. On that day, you were not only meeting the other person as they were, you were also meeting the relationship as it was, without your ongoing, invisible restoration of it, and you were meeting yourself as the one who had been restoring it. There is a grief in that recognition that ordinary language does not know how to name. It is not the grief of losing someone, it is the grief of learning that a version of them, the version you were quietly maintaining, was partly authored by you. That version can no longer be maintained, not because you decided to abandon it, but because the strength required to hold it up has finally left your hands. You did not choose this clarity. It arrived when the translation muscle finally rested. And in resting, it revealed something you had not been able to see while it was working. It revealed that you had been organizing your inner life around the emotional visibility of people who had not been organizing theirs around yours. The exchange had been asymmetrical for a long time. The asymmetry remained invisible because your side of it felt like your character, while their side of it felt like their circumstances. You had made your labor into character and their absence into context. In Jungian terms, the identity of the endlessly understanding person can become a persona. It is not necessarily a lie. It may begin as a necessary adaptation, a way of remaining connected to people whose reality would otherwise feel too painful to accept. But over time, the adaptation is mistaken for the whole self. Beneath that persona, in the shadow, gather all the perceptions you were not permitted to trust. Anger, refusal, disappointment, the simple knowledge that something hurt. When the persona begins to loosen, the shadow does not first appear as evil or darkness. It appears as an unwelcome fact. This happened. They chose it. It affected me. That reversal is not a small one. Sit with it for a moment. What you called being an understanding person was also, in part, an arrangement in which your understanding performed the work that the relationship itself refused to do. The understanding was the relationship. Without it, there was often, quietly, less relationship than you had allowed yourself to know. This is not a verdict on anyone. It is a description of a structure. Structures are not villains, but structures have costs, and the cost of this one has been arriving in your body for some time now. It appears in the tiredness before certain conversations, in the relief when certain plans are cancelled, and in the strange peace that enters when someone you love is briefly not requiring anything from you. That peace is not coldness. It is the first honest breath of a self that has been translating for too long and has begun, without permission and without ceremony, to stop. But the moment you stop translating them, another voice begins speaking inside you. It is the voice that once taught you your clarity was dangerous, your anger was unfair, and your refusal would cost you love, and that voice may not belong to you. What began as a single quiet moment across from someone has, by now, begun to spread. It is no longer contained within one relationship. It is changing the way you meet the entire texture of your life. And the strange thing is not that clarity has arrived. The strange thing is how much of your existing life was built by the same labor that clarity is now dissolving. You did not realize, until the translation began to fail, how many rooms of your life had been constructed around it. This was not something you did occasionally. It was the load-bearing wall. It held up friendships whose one-sidedness you had never allowed yourself to measure. It held up family arrangements in which your steady interpretation of everyone's behavior preserved a peace no one else was willing to maintain. It also held up a working life in which you understood your colleagues faster than they understood themselves, and paid for that understanding with an exhaustion no one saw. You believed you were simply a perceptive person moving through ordinary human situations. You were, in fact, a perceptive person performing an enormous amount of invisible structural work and calling that work your personality. In Jungian terms, this is where the persona begins to reveal not only its face, but the machinery supporting it. The persona was the loving, patient, understanding person the world had learned to recognize. Beneath it ran a private, interpretive system that turned other people into more bearable versions of themselves, allowing the persona to remain intact. The problem was not that you had a persona. Everyone needs a social face through which to meet the world. The problem was that maintaining yours required you to continually edit your own experience. The system became so refined that even you no longer knew it was operating. And it was operating because, at some point, it had been necessary. You do not need to locate a single dramatic origin, nor do you need to turn yourself into the wounded child of a perfect explanatory story. It is enough to notice that somewhere, early enough that the memory may have no clear edges, you learned that other people's difficult behavior felt safer when you understood it than when you simply received it. Understanding turned unpredictability into pattern. It turned neglect into circumstance. It turned coldness into private struggle. And once behavior became pattern, circumstance, or private struggle, it no longer felt as though it were aimed directly at you. The translation was, at its origin, a way of surviving what was happening without having to feel the full impact of what was happening. That is the hidden bargain beneath the sensitivity others praised. You were not simply gifted at reading people. You had trained yourself to read them because reading them was less painful than feeling what their behavior did to you. If you knew why someone was distant, their distance became information. If you did not know why, their distance felt like rejection, so you became very good at knowing why. You became the person in every room who could explain what the difficult person was really going through. You could locate fear beneath anger, shame beneath contempt, and private suffering beneath withdrawal. The skill did not remain confined to the place where you first learned it. It followed you into many of the relationships you formed afterward. Notice, without shame, how completely this pattern helped shape the life you now live. The friends you kept were often the ones who needed to be understood. The partners you chose were often the ones whose behavior required interpretation. The work that attracted you often placed you in the position of translating difficult people into workable dynamics. You did not consciously arrange this. The old pattern helped arrange it. It was drawn toward environments where its skills were needed because being needed for this particular ability came close enough to being loved that your body did not always know the difference. And here is where the arrangement grew teeth. Being needed for your understanding was not the same as being known. The people who benefited from your interpretive labor knew the interpreter. They knew the one who softened them into legibility. They knew the version of themselves that became possible in your presence. What they rarely encountered was you without the function you performed for them. You may have felt this without being able to name it. There is a particular loneliness that appears inside relationships where you are deeply valued for a labor no one has admitted you are performing. You can be surrounded by people who would say, without hesitation, that they love you and still be unable to locate where, inside their love, you actually exist. Quietly, you may suspect that if you stop translating them into their better selves, something in their affection for you would begin to waver. You do not test this suspicion because testing it feels unbearable, so you keep translating. The mechanism keeps running, and the loneliness deepens beneath a life that looks warm from the outside. In Jungian terms, this resembles the autonomous activity of a complex. A complex is not merely a memory from the past. It is an emotionally charged pattern that can acquire a life of its own, organizing perception and response before the conscious self realizes that a choice has been made. The pattern was not simply repeating, it was building. Each new relationship added another wall to the structure. Each new environment reinforced the belief that the interpreter was welcome, needed, valuable, perhaps even indispensable. The world confirmed, over and over, that this way of being with people worked, and every confirmation made the arrangement more difficult to see. Because arrangements that work are the hardest ones to notice. A pattern that hurts you openly may eventually be examined. A pattern that rewards you steadily can operate for decades without inspection. And this one rewarded you. It did. That has to be said plainly. It gave you access to intimacy from which you might otherwise have felt excluded. It gave you a place in rooms where you did not know how else to belong. It gave you the deep, particular satisfaction of becoming the one person someone difficult finally trusted. It gave you a form of usefulness that felt remarkably similar to being chosen. There is no honesty in this recognition without admitting how much the arrangement provided. But every reward it gave you was paid for by a corresponding withdrawal. Something in you had to remain small so the interpreter could remain skilled. The interpreter could not afford preferences that inconvenienced the people being interpreted. The interpreter could not afford an anger strong enough to break the frame. The interpreter could not afford sustained disappointment, because disappointment threatened to end the translation. And without the translation, the relationship might reveal how little belonging it could actually hold. So you learned to send your own inconvenient responses somewhere else, underground, into fatigue, into numbness, into the vague sense that although you were present for everyone else, you were not fully present inside your own life. The unlived part of you did not disappear. It went underground, and it has been living there quietly for as long as the old system has been running. You may have felt it recently in ways you could not fully explain. A flatness in situations that once felt meaningful. A strange emotional silence during conversations you expected to enjoy. A muted quality to your own reactions, as though you were observing them from somewhere slightly outside yourself. This does not automatically mean depression, and not every experience of flatness has the same cause, but within this pattern, it can be what happens when a large part of a person has been forced underground for years and has finally begun to press upward for reasons the conscious identity cannot yet name. That pressure from below is what has weakened the translation. The mechanism was not damaged by a single event. It was worn down from underneath. The unlived material inside you began, very slowly, to refuse to keep funding the interpretive work every time you extended another gracious explanation for someone's behavior. Something in you had to be borrowed to pay for it. After enough years of borrowing, the account began to run empty, not dramatically, just quietly, just enough that one day, while sitting across from someone, the sentence that had always appeared did not appear. You called that moment cruelty because you did not yet understand that it was solvency. Something inside you had finally refused to pay for another translation it could no longer afford. Watch how many parts of your life this touches. Watch how the arrangement extended beyond the obvious relationships and into places you had never associated with it. The way you moderated your opinions in group conversations so that everyone's position could remain livable. The way you softened emails so difficult recipients would not feel accused. The way you excused someone's lateness, distraction, or forgetfulness before they had time to feel exposed. Each was a small act of translation. Each seemed too insignificant to count. Together, they became the daily labor of holding a world together for people who did not know they were being held. And you did not know either. You thought you were simply being considerate. Consideration became the medium through which you moved. But somewhere inside that consideration lived a fear. The fear that if you stopped doing this work, your relationships would reveal themselves to be less mutual than you needed them to be. There was the fear that if you stopped preemptively excusing people, their behavior toward you would arrive undressed, and you would have to see it. The fear that if you allowed the room to contain its own difficulty without quietly reshaping it, you might discover that you were not as loved as the warmth in the room had suggested. That is the second layer of the bargain. The translation did not only protect them from being seen, it protected you from having to see how you were being met. There is a particular gravity to this recognition. It means that the sensitivity for which you were praised was not only generosity, it was also protection. Protection against a truth you were not yet ready to know about your relationships. Protection against the possibility that some of the love around you had been softened by your own labor and might look different without it. The mechanism did not only translate other people, it translated your own life back to you. It rendered your relationships in the tones you could bear. And now that mechanism is weakening, not because you decided to become a harder person, but because the part of you that has been underfunded for years has finally begun to send back its refusal. The refusal is quiet. It looks like the missing sentence. It looks like the tiredness that arrives before certain names appear. It looks like the unexpected peace you feel when a conversation you once would have wanted does not happen. It looks like the day you saw someone clearly and, instead of reshaping what you saw, allowed it to remain what it was. You cannot return to the old life on the same terms, not because you have chosen to leave it, but because the labor that made those terms possible is no longer available to you at the same price. The old system can still be activated for a while, but it costs more than it once did, and every use leaves you emptier than before. Something in the arrangement has reached the limit of what it can continue to fund. The translator is still here, but for the first time, you can see who has been paying for its work. You were. After clarity arrives, the first consequence is not freedom, it is exhaustion, a specific exhaustion that ordinary rest does not seem to reach. You sleep, and you wake, and it is already there, sitting on your chest before the day has begun. During the years when the old system was running, you assumed that if you could just get through the current difficult period, the tiredness would lift, but it does not lift. It only becomes visible, because the tiredness was never only about the current period, it was the accumulated weight of decades of unpaid interpretive labor arriving all at once. Now that the labor has stopped funding itself with your unlived life, you notice, inside this new stillness, that certain people have become physically difficult to be near, not in ways you can easily explain to anyone. Their voice on the phone changes something in your shoulders. Their name in a message tightens the base of your throat. The thought of seeing them creates a fatigue that arrives before the meeting itself. You used to receive these signals and immediately override them with a gracious explanation of what the person might be going through. Now the signals arrive and remain. Your body, which has been sending these reports for years, is finally being read without correction, and what it reports is inconvenient. It reports that being near some people has required more from your body than the relationship has been giving back. This is the sentence you did not want to reach. It is the sentence the translation existed to prevent, because to know this is to feel that you must do something with it, and you have spent so much of your life not knowing it that the knowledge itself feels like a small violence against the version of you who survived inside the not knowing. But it is not violence, it is arithmetic. The account was always being kept. You were simply the last person permitted to look at it. And here the shadow begins to move, not as something evil or destructive, but as everything the understanding persona could not allow into consciousness. Beneath the generous interpretations and patient explanations, there has been, for a long time, resentment. It was not always loud. Often it was a slow-burning resentment, too dangerous to feel while the old system was operating. To feel it would have threatened the entire interpretive frame. It would have meant admitting that the care was also labor, that the labor carried a cost, and that a cost left unacknowledged for years eventually becomes something colder than disappointment. You did not want to become a resentful person, so you became a compassionate one. The compassion was real, but it also carried the resentment it had been asked to conceal. This is where the sentence turns. If the compassion carried resentment, then some of what you called love was also the sound of you refusing to let yourself become angry with the people you loved. The generosity was not a lie, but it was not only generosity, it was also the shape your fury took when fury was not permitted to have a shape of its own. Notice how your body responds to this. There may be a small resistance, an impulse to defend the purity of what you gave. Sit with that resistance. The purity is not being taken away. What is being taken away is the belief that generosity and resentment cannot exist inside the same act. In you, they have lived together for a long time. Generosity was the visible face. Resentment was the private cost of maintaining that face. And now the cost is showing. It appears in the way you can no longer hear certain complaints without something inside you taking a quiet step backward. Someone tells you about another difficulty, and instead of the old immediate warmth, there is a pause. You still listen. You may still care, but something in you no longer automatically volunteers to carry what they are handing you. You notice the pause and feel guilty. You think you are becoming the kind of person you once gently disapproved of, the person who does not fully listen, the person who has become self-absorbed, the person who has grown hard. But you have not grown hard, you have grown more accurate. You are finally metabolizing information about who has been carrying whom. That accuracy is producing a coolness where there used to be automatic warmth. The coolness is not the end of your care. It is the end of your care being unlimited. And unlimited care was never the correct measurement of your love. It was the measurement of your fear that if you cared less, you would be discarded. That fear deserves to be named honestly. The old system was not only protecting other people from being seen and protecting you from seeing your relationships clearly, it was protecting you from something more specific. The possibility that if you stopped being infinitely understanding, some of the people around you might leave. Not necessarily through confrontation, perhaps quietly, through distance, through fewer messages, through a gradual turning towards someone else who would perform the work you had been performing. You did not want to discover whether someone's presence in your life depended partly upon your labor, so you kept laboring, and the labor prevented the question from ever being answered. Now the labor is weakening, and reality will begin answering the question in its own time. Some relationships may become more honest. Others may protest the change. A few may quietly thin. But exhaustion is not an instruction to cut anyone off. And resentment is not a final verdict on another person. Both are information. They tell you where something has been happening that your conscious identity refused to count. The first boundary often appears before any spoken boundary. It is the moment you let another person's discomfort remain where it began. You do not rush to explain the silence, repair the tension, or supply the motive that would make their behavior easier to receive. The room may feel less warm for a while. What has changed is not your capacity for care. What has changed is your willingness to manufacture warmth by abandoning the evidence of your own experience. This pause exposes another shadowed wish that if you understand people perfectly enough, no one will be able to surprise or abandon you. Translation promised more than connection. It promised control over the meaning of what happened. To release the role is therefore to surrender a form of imagined safety. You can no longer guarantee that every rupture will become understandable. Every distance will acquire a compassionate explanation, or every loss will be converted into a lesson. Some things will remain painful and incomplete. Clarity does not remove that uncertainty. It allows you to stop paying for certainty with your own disappearance. And that uncertainty is the ordinary price of meeting another person without privately arranging the encounter in advance. It asks you to remain present while meaning is unfinished, while affection is unproven, and while another person is still free to disappoint you. This is more vulnerable than translation ever allowed. It is also more real. Before you decide what any relationship means, You must learn how to remain present long enough to hear that information without immediately translating it away. You may still love these people and no longer be able to translate for them. Both can be true. Love does not obligate the labor. But this is exactly where the guilt sits, because you have never learned how to love someone without also making them easier to understand. The two acts have never been separated inside your experience. Their separation therefore feels, at first, like a subtraction from love itself. It is not. It is the first honest shape love can take without being subsidized by your disappearance. Something in you has been disappearing for so long that its ongoing disappearance came to feel like devotion. You called it selflessness, you called it maturity, you called it caring more deeply than other people cared. Beneath those beautiful names was an arrangement in which parts of you had to remain absent so that parts of someone else could remain unexamined. That arrangement was not devotion. It was a private economy in which your absence funded their comfort, and their comfort was interpreted by both of you as intimacy. The intimacy was partly real. This is not being taken away. What is being taken away is the belief that intimacy required your absence. It did not require it. It required it only under terms you had accepted without ever consciously negotiating them. And now the shadow reveals a second truth. It does not contain only your anger about what you gave, it also contains your attachment to the role itself. Some of what you called love for these people was also love for the arrangement they made possible. The arrangement in which you were the understanding one, the arrangement in which your worth was measured by your ability to make difficult people legible. You did not only serve them, the role served you too. It gave you a place, it gave you a recognizable identity, it gave you a kind of value that was difficult to replace. It protected you from the vulnerability of being present as your ordinary self, without a service to provide, and without another person's need to justify your place beside them. To be present without the labor would have meant risking a discovery you were not ready to make, that the ordinary you might not be. What some of these relationships had been organized around, the old system protected you from that discovery. Now it is weakening, and the discovery is arriving without clean edges. It comes in small waves. A conversation that once felt warm now feels like work. A person you used to defend now feels, quietly, like someone you have been carrying. A memory of your generosity develops a strange aftertaste because you can finally feel, inside the memory, the small ache of the part of you that was being spent to fund it. This is not a betrayal of your past kindness. It is the completion of it. Your kindness is finally being seen by the person who gave it, at the cost that person actually paid, and the cost was not small. The cost was a version of you who never got to be inconvenient, a version of you who could not tolerate being misunderstood without immediately clarifying, a version of you who could not sit inside another person's projection without gently and patiently dissolving it. It was a version of you who was never allowed to be the difficult one because you had built your life around making difficulty bearable for everyone else. That version of you deserves to exist, not to punish anyone, not to become cruel, simply to exist, to take up ordinary space, to be occasionally wrong without preemptively softening the wrongness, to be tired without immediately explaining the tiredness, to be disappointed without turning the disappointment into something. The person who disappointed you can comfortably receive, and here the ground begins to soften beneath you, because you do not yet know how to be that person. You know how to be the translator, you know how to be generous, patient, perceptive, and endlessly available. You do not yet know who you are when those functions are set down. The old arrangement can no longer continue in its previous form. But there is no finished identity waiting to replace it. There is only this strange, unfamiliar quiet where the labor used to be, a quiet in which you are neither cruel nor kind in the old, exhausting sense, a quiet in which you are, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, present without a service to perform, and that presence does not initially feel like liberation. It feels like standing inside a room whose furniture has been removed while you were not looking, and realizing that you do not yet know how to sit down. The first sign that other people have noticed is not confrontation. It is a small shift in tone. A friend says, with a lightness that does not quite land, that you seem different lately. A family member mentions in passing that you used to be easier to talk to. A partner asks, without apparent weight, whether something is wrong. You answer that you are fine, and perhaps you are fine, but their questions may not be only about your well-being. They may also be the first tremors of an arrangement, beginning to notice that its foundation has shifted. They are not necessarily lying when they say they miss the old you. They may genuinely miss you, but what they may be less able to recognize is that they also miss the version of you who made their contradictions easier to live with, the version who received their difficulty and returned it as understanding, the version whose steady interpretive warmth allowed them to remain in your presence, largely unexamined. You will feel the pull to reassure them. The old mechanism, though weakened, still remembers its roots. It will offer you familiar sentences. It is not you, it is me. I have just been tired. Nothing has changed. These sentences may approach your mouth before you have consciously chosen them. Notice that they are not only answers, they are restorations. They are the translator briefly waking to repair the frame. You do not have to say them. You also do not have to make a speech explaining why you will not say them. The silence in which you simply refuse to provide the old reassurance is enough. It is the smallest possible refusal, and for someone who had grown accustomed to your labor without realizing they depended upon it, it may feel like the loudest possible one. Some people will adjust, slowly, awkwardly, perhaps with small resentments that eventually stop being mentioned. They will begin reflecting on their own behavior because you are no longer explaining it for them. This may be uncomfortable. It will not destroy them. In some relationships, it will introduce a strange new honesty, an honesty that had been prevented by the very translation you once believed was making the relationship deeper. Other people may not adjust. They may drift. Their messages may thin, and their availability may quietly diminish. They may eventually find someone else who performs the function you have set down, without ever consciously recognizing that this is what they are doing. This will hurt in a particular way. Their fading may confirm something you had spent years arranging not to know, that some part of what felt like love for you was also attachment to the labor you provided. Once that labor disappears, they may not know how to remain connected to the person who is left. You will grieve them, and beneath the grief, There may be something you did not expect. Relief, not triumphant relief, not the satisfaction of proving that you were right about them. It will be a quiet, almost embarrassed relief, the relief of a body that has stopped carrying a weight